How do you
There's,
know?
how do I know
How
what?
do you know? How do you know that they're not trying to pick military targets? How do you
One, I
know?
don't think they've
Give
ever
someone,
publicly even
give me the
given.
resources
Hold on.
for this event for
Hey,
October
half this
7th.
call
What
needs
do
to
you know
leave,
about
or I'm
it?
not staying here.
Okay,
Like,
wait,
I'm not
hold
going to
on.
do a dog pile
Axel,
when I don't have
hold
a
on,
computer
hold
in
on.
front of me.
Axel, the super easy thing right here, okay? I'm just curious. Can you show me a single statement by anybody representative of Hamas saying we don't try to target civilians?
Go read through the 12-page report. Absolutely 100%. Go look at it. It came out like a week ago where they say what their goals were, why they did what they did, and that civilian casualties were never intentional. That's what they said.
Wait. What is this
No other
12-page
terrorist
report
group.
written by Hamas?
Yes. Yes. It came out like a week ago. I don't know if you missed it, but Mass offers explanation or something like that, or their side. Which I'm not saying I agree with their interpretation, but yeah, they have
Wait,
what
can you?
they put
I
out
keep asking for
officially.
any source on any of
Yeah, I'm
this.
gonna send it
Nobody's
to you.
linked me
Okay,
anything.
first of all, I already sent you the source for the armed struggle that Palestinians have the right to armed struggle, and right now I'm gonna send you the Hamas's official explanation.
This was an explanation that came out fairly recently. That was after a lot of bombardment and some unrest. There's also been I mean, are you really taking that to be evidence that they didn't intentionally target civilians during
Well, I would
October
just be
7th?
curious. I'd be curious to at least see that. I'd be
That's yeah,
surprised if.
Yeah.
that's literally what he
There's
asked
not
for.
intercepted documents. I mean, I can pull that up, but there's been intercepted documents effectively just ordering a massacre. Not to mention their outcome in terms of relative risk. Did someone mention
Hold on.
civilian casualty ratio here, by the way?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, well,
Lycan
we can
brings it
talk
up a
about
No one
lot.
civilian
Yeah.
mentioned that.
ratio. I'm just
Oh
using
my
wait.
goodness.
First
All
of
right, we
all,
have to talk about that because anyone talking about civilian casualty
I
ratios
said I'm not doing Stop. Avi, forethought, do not want to talk to either of you if I don't have a computer in front of me. And I don't really know if I really want to talk yet about the fucking
Well, it doesn't have
proportionality
to
thing
be,
yet,
well, it doesn't have to
because
be you. It doesn't have to be you. I could do it for the room. I can explain to the room why anyone mentioning civilian casualty ratios at this point doesn't know what the hell they're talking about in terms of measuring discrimination, in terms of measuring adherence to distinction, and should be discounted. For
even the guy who emailed Steven, the military guy that everyone said is dunking on Lycan, who ended up talking to me privately, and him and I don't disagree too much, so I don't know what interpretation y'all got from it. But even he said, when it comes to discrimination or indiscrimination, it comes down to intent.
Yeah, it
And
does
that
come.
was
Yeah, no kidding. Of course, no shit. It comes down to
it
intent.
doesn't come down to the numbers.
Oh, what are you even saying? Of course, it doesn't come down to numbers. No fucking shit. That's why it's a metric and not an analytic equivalence relation. You can use outcomes to make an inference about intent. No shit. Of course. The point is just that the civilian casualty ratio fails as a metric to make that inference a lot worse than relative risk. That's the point. Relative risk, there's a very strong inference you can make, especially when there's orders of magnitude difference, that civilian casualty ratio simply fails at. And if you look at October 7th, the relative risk falls right in the line of classical genocides or contested genocides, whereas that's not
What,
the case with Israel.
what do you know about? And here come the meme comments. What do you know about CAS-led versus Operation Protective Edge?
Led an Operation Protective Edge in terms of their civilian casualty ratios and in terms of their relative risk. If you look at the relative risk for led comes out to a relative risk. And by the way, this is also
Oh
taking.
no, just to be clear, I'm asking on the whole, not just about those numbers. I'm asking what do you know about the operations themselves from both the IDF and from the Hamas side?
Uh, in terms of what I'm aware of the Goldstone report, which I can go into, and I can go into my issues with that. I can go into the studies that the Goldstone report commented on, which looks like they didn't even read
Do
them.
you know why the Goldstone report says or why IDF tactics changed for Protective Edge versus CAS-led?
I don't know that offhand. No.
It was because of the Goldstone report, and the Goldstone report highlighted
Oh,
the
I see what you're saying.
methodology.
Yes. No, I understand. I understand. But regardless, again, that's just going to take a secondhand backseat to what the actual outcomes are in the way they're operating. So actually, by the way, cast lead. My view on cast lead is it was actually better than Protective Edge, slightly. So I don't actually think they improved. I actually have the opposite view. I actually think Israel actually did a little bit worse in Protective Edge in terms of their relative risk and adhering to the principle of discernment. So if they tried to do that, I think they failed.
That's interesting because in Operation Protective Edge, they wouldn't move anywhere because the tunnels were actually making it them take casualties, which have very little to no tolerance in Israel for.
I don't see how
So
this is compatible with my view at all.
Because I don't understand how you arrived at that conclusion. They didn't do better. They literally did not kill as many civilians. They did not do as much civilian infrastructure
That's not
destruction.
what I mean by doing better. That's not what I mean by doing better. It's not the total amount of civilians you kill. It's not
It
what
was
this is.
tremendous difference,
Okay.
and yet still skewed in the direction of like way more civilians dying than should have.
You're just not tracking. Okay. You can. My view of when I say doing better, just to be clear, okay, let's disambiguate it. I'm not talking about killing less civilians. I'm talking about adhering to the principle of discernment. You can kill more civilians. You can kill 10 times as many civilians while adhering better to the principle of discernment, depending on how many militants there are. It's your ability to differentiate militant from civilian, the risk that gets conferred on a militant compared to a civilian. That's what I'm talking about. So I don't want to hear anything about, oh, but they killed less civilians. Yeah, no shit, they killed less civilians. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about.
To be clear, both were bad. First of all, on the
when I say bad or good, I'm not going to use bad or good anymore. I'm just going to say the adherence to the principle of discernment was worse on Protective Edge than it was Cast Lead.
Can you dive in depth into that?
I can go into that if you'd like. And by the way, that's assuming all of the friendly numbers from the UN. That's assuming all of the police force, by the way, that they took an issue with. They were killed in Cast Lead. That's assuming all of them were civilians, by the way. Even though the study that the Goldstone report dismissed, which basically they misquoted the methodology. They basically didn't look like they didn't even read it. The Orient study, which not only documented the membership of Hamas and Al-Qassam brigades of a huge amount of the police forces, and they didn't just assume they were Al-Qassam because they were Hamas, like the Goldstone report alleged. That was not the methodology at all. They actually mentioned specific events where the police forces were dying while taking up arms, engaging in combat with the IDF, and I assumed they were all civilians anyway. And even if you give all those Steelman assumptions, which decrease the performance and discernment for Cast Lead, you still get a better value than Protective Edge. And I didn't even do any of those assumptions for Protective Edge. I give Steelman after Steelman, and Cast Lead still came out better. And I'm happy to go through all those details and all of the ridiculous claims of the Goldstone report about that study, by the way.
I'm happy to as well. So I think that's a good idea to do. Unless it's all on Twitter, I'll get it all from there. We can go over it, and then we can do a 5-hour deep dive.
I'll send you the Orient study. It shouldn't even take 2 hours. It shouldn't take 5 hours. I'll send you the author of the study.
Listen, I've done enough of these conversations, and it's going to turn into source counter source very quickly. And so I'm just saying I'll put aside 5 hours for it.
No, I'll send you the source and the counter source. I'm aware of all of it. I've read all of this. Look,
if you already have all your counter sources to Goldstone and you want to send those over, I'm happy to review so that we can.
Counter source. I've read the Orient study. I've read the Goldstone report counter source to the Orient study. There is no counter to that study. It just, if you look at, except what's written by Dershowitz, which is really like a joke. Dershowitz gave a very weak rebuttal, and if he actually
so did the United States Congress.
Yeah, so did the United States Congress. Because you know why? Because neither Dershowitz nor the United States Congress actually read the Orient study because it's in Hebrew. Either it's because it's in Hebrew or they just didn't get it translated and didn't take the time to look at it. But anyone who did take the time to look at it, they would have lambasted the Goldstone report for just making shit up about the study they basically didn't read. Because they claimed that they assumed that Al-Qassam membership was based on Hamas membership when it clearly absolutely wasn't. They just pulled that out of their ass. In fact, the author of the study even follows me on Twitter. That's not what he did at all. Anyone who reads the methodology of that study, that is absolutely a fabrication of the study. The Goldstone report just made that up. And their second criticism of the study, which is claiming the claiming bias, which is that, oh, well, maybe they really weren't terrorists because Al-Qassam, even though they were listed as terrorists on the Al-Qassam website, what that was really just because they were claiming them, and then...
Wait, I'm sorry. Do you really think those are the most egregious claims against Israel by the Goldstone report?
When you literally fabricate claims about a study that you didn't read, that Israel's providing, I mean, that's pretty fucking bad. That's called...
I'm talking about incidents of civilian deaths that were documented in the Goldstone report. That's what I'm talking about.
This is the point of contention. Because if what they say on that study goes through, they're not civilian deaths. They're militants.
Every single one. There is not a single account of civilian death in that report.
You're not trying. I'm saying that the Goldstone report jacked up the civilian deaths in cast lead by essentially classifying all. And by the way, this was done not just by Goldstone Report, but Salem did this as well. They classified all of the police forces, the Palestinian police forces, as non-militants, as civilians, and that's a huge point of contention. Now, what Israel did was they sent a study. They said, "Okay, fine, we'll collaborate. Here's this Orient study," and they detailed every single name of every police officer and all the details around many cases, the details around their death. Many times they were involved in directly participating in active fire with the IDF, if not planting explosive, if not in engineering suicide bombs, if not launching rockets. And all of that was ignored by the Goldstone Report. And you know what they said in response? And said, "Oh, they just assume they're Al-Qassam because they're Hamas, and there's a claiming bias because they're claiming them as martyrs, and they weren't really martyrs. They weren't really their martyrs." That's what
what I remember from the report. I remember the report explicitly saying
about the Orient study specifically.
About the Orient study? No, I don't remember that.
The Orient study. That's what this is about. We're talking about the Orient study because the
Goldstone Report does call out Hamas. I said Hassan does call out Hamas explicitly. Does say there were rockets or war crimes, and does say they need to cease.
I'm not talking. We're not talking about that. Let's focus on track. What we're talking about is the distinction between whether the police force in cast lead were civilian deaths or militant deaths. That's what we're talking about.
I count them as militant deaths. So
okay, well they don't. They count them. Goldstone Report and the UN and all the human NGO, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem.
I think technically, they would be considered civilian deaths. What if someone bombed the United States? Like, I don't think our police force would be counted.
They're civilian deaths, and I don't even disagree with that necessarily. I don't say police forces should be automatically assumed. I think I actually overall even agree with the Goldstone Report and UN on that standard, and that's the same standard when I calculated October 7th, by the way. I applied that to cast lead, I applied that to October 7th. The problem is, so the standard is on an individual basis, on an individual level, you assume the police force are civilians unless you have evidence on an individual level that they are participating or taking up arms as a militant. Then they're a militant. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that standard. The problem I have is that the Orient study met that standard. The Orient study was provided, and they saw it. They saw that individual names of the police force, and they were detailed. There was detailed documentation of them taking up arms and launching rockets and blowing themselves up or participating in active fire with the IDF, and they didn't address any of those things. They made two criticisms of the study. One was a fabrication. The other one was a reasonable bias, but still didn't address the individual levels, and they calculated all civilians anyway. That's egregious. It's a joke.
All right, well, you and I will schedule a time. We'll get down on this bad boy. Send me all the stuff you need.
I do want to make a point about why civilian casualty. I want to explain to everyone why civilian casualty ratio is a joke compared to relative risk in terms of measuring discernment. All right. Imagine the three following scenarios. Scenario number, let's just say you have a strategy of being as indiscriminate as possible. Okay, you're just going to throw bombs on cities randomly. You're going to randomly bomb. We all agree that's indiscriminate. That's maximally indiscriminate, right? We all agree on that strategy. You're going to randomly throw bombs at a city you're sieging.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So let's say that the city has a militant to civilian population of 50-50, right? You kill everyone. You randomly bomb the city, you kill everyone. What's your civilian casualty ratio? It's 1-to-1, right?
Yep.
You killed everyone. Okay. Now let's say the city has a civilian to militant population of 90% to 10%. What's your civilian casualty ratio now? 9-to-1, right?
Yep.
Now let's say you have a city with 10% civilians and 90% militants. What's your civilian casualty ratio now? 0.1, right?
Yep.
In one case, you look great. In another case, you look terrible. In another case, you look so-so. But what was your strategy the entire time? to be as maximally indiscriminate as possible. So the point is that when I run these analytics, comparing relative risk to civilian casualty ratio isn't actually tracking with what we mean by discernment. The adherence to the principle of discernment doesn't track with discrimination, because you can get a wildly different civilian casualty ratio with the same exact strategy, with no change in your strategy. You could intend to be as maximally indiscriminate as possible and literally just kill everyone and look really good, really bad, or so-so, depending on the relative proportions of how many militants and how many civilians you have in a population. That's why it doesn't work. What does work way better is a very simple tweak. It's just doing the per capita version of it. So instead of civilian casualty ratio, it's militants killed divided by militant population over civilians killed divided by civilian population. Your percentage of militants killed divided by your percentage of civilians killed. So let's go back to those 3 cases again. If you kill everyone, being maximally indiscriminate, 50-50 population, what's your relative risk? Well, it's 1, because civilians killed divided by civilian population is just going to come out to 1. Militants killed divided by militant population is going to come out to 1 anyway. If in the second case, where it's 90-10, also 1, because the percentages are also 100% of each. In the case where it's 10-90, also 1. So you'll notice you get the same answer. This is actually tracking, and 1 makes sense. Relative risk of 1 means that there's no additional conferred risk as a status of a militant compared to the status of a civilian. That's the point. The point is that in all of these cases, relative civilian casualty ratio is not tracking, but relative risk tracks. And when you actually look at a naturally generated data set of different urban battles, and I say urban battles because that's tracking the Gaza situation more, I have at least 40 battles in my data set, 5 of which are contested genocides, 5 of which are genocides. What you see is that if you go by civilian casualty ratio, you get all these weird results. Even ISIS starts looking not so bad. During their northern Iraq offensive, the civilian casualty ratio of ISIS wasn't actually that far from the first battle of Fallujah, even though they genocided the Yazidis, and everyone would agree that ISIS did not have the same strategy in mind that the United States did in the first battle of Fallujah. You also get even Nazi Germany in the siege of Leningrad, it does not look so bad. But when you do relative risk, it all makes sense. Battle of Fallujah, yeah, it was like 17. So clearly discriminate, but could have been a lot better. When you do ISIS, relative risk was actually in the direction of being discriminate towards civilians. It was even less than 1.
Sorry, Avi, what point are you making right now? I missed what Lycan said at the beginning.
The point, well, how much wait. How much did you miss? We talked about a lot of stuff.
Just the second half right now that you're talking through, like percentages of civilians killed.
Yeah. So the second half is I'm explaining why. I'm explaining why civilian casualty ratio, mentioning how just the raw number of how many civilians you killed, how many militants you killed, is a very, very poor metric at measuring adherence to the principle of discernment. And there's
I would say sometimes, right? Sometimes.
Well, actually, not. Overall, compared to a different metric, there's a different metric that overall is way better.
Sure. What's that?
Which is relative risk. Which is militants killed divided by militant population over civilians killed divided by civilian population.
Militants killed divided by militants.
I think in plain terms, say you were going to go and bomb a country. Say you were going to go and bomb a country and say that there are 99 terrorists and there are 1 civilian. Okay. If you were to bomb that country, and you were to kill like 1 civilian and 10 terrorists, right? You might say that well, look at my ratio of terrorists killed to civilians, it's 10-1. Right? But you might say, okay, well, hold on. You killed the entire civilian population. There was literally 1 civilian there and you killed him. So if anything, it kind of seems like you were almost targeting civilians more, statistically speaking, than actual terrorists. Because you managed to hit the 1 civilian in the country. So what he's saying is that when we're trying to figure out an appropriate amount of if we're trying to figure out if discernment is happening, where when we say discernment, we're saying, is there going to be discrimination between military and non-military targets? When we're looking at discernment, what we should be looking at is, of all the deaths that are happening, how many are civilian versus how many are militants? And then we have to figure out what is the total civilian population versus the total militant population is the question. So if there's an even amount, if there's a 50-50 split between civilians and militants, then I think all of this analysis, I think mathematically doesn't matter. But if there's not, if there's way more civilians, there's 80% are civilians and 20% are militants, well, we have to start adjusting using relative risk ratio, how we would expect the casualties to look if there's discernment happening, essentially, Yeah.
Okay, sorry. That all makes sense. So I guess my question would be then, who do we trust in terms of actual percentage that were killed were civilians, versus
that's a question. That's a different question. If we agree on that, we can talk about where do we get the
I think okay. So I guess I would just ask one more question before we get to that. Let's say, for example, in a hypothetical scenario where the numbers didn't look that bad, right? It was let's say it turns out that Israel, half of all that they killed were actually militants and half were civilians. Okay, for argument's sake. But let's say that 50% of those civilians that were killed were intentionally targeted. That kind of throws the whole ratio out the window, right?
Yeah, no,
they were automatically killed.
Yeah, so it's not, the ratio doesn't like, so look, there's no analytical equivalence relation in any metric. There's no metric I can give you that can say with absolute 100% certainty that, an event within them didn't occur.
You're just saying
An
that you
overall
can't just make an assumption based on 50% dying doesn't necessarily like there's more.
The problem what his hold on, what his analysis is trying to do is he's using a crude and arguably inappropriate analysis, but that's because it's a counter to the other crude and more inappropriate analyses of the justification of indiscriminate targeting. So the answer is usually,
that's what I was trying to get at. What is the justification that was just said where you're responding with this analysis?
The justification is they're clearly indiscriminately targeting civilians because this many civilians have died, and this many are militants and this many are civilians. That's always the justification given. There's never a qualitative analysis of, well, is there actual indiscriminate targeting going on? It's usually just raw numbers. And if you want to make just a raw number argument, then Avi is arguing, well, there's actually a statistical method we can use to approach this to figure out if this is actually happening.
Except we never, ever measure discrimination based on that.
Well, no. Hold on. Wait. You don't measure discrimination.
No, hold on. Wait. No, before what you say, because you've made this argument against me before, and you've said that I'm coming at this conclusion with nothing. No. Based on my military experience, based on my understanding of warfare, and based on my understanding of the number of bombs lobbed and the areas attacked, and the fact that you can see a measurable satellite footprint of all the damage done to civilian infrastructure, yes, from that, you can arrive to the conclusion, still waiting for a further affirmation, that indiscriminate bombing has taken place based on the number of people dying, the number of bombs being dropped, and the number of people confirmed to be women and children.
Yeah, every single thing you just said is completely wrong, and there will not be a single military person that backs what you're saying up there. All of that is wrong. None of that is determinative for if discrimination is happening properly or not, because civilian casualties.
Yes. Wait, I'm sorry, Stephen. You don't get to just take any target any way you want, right?
No, you don't. But if it's a military target, you assess there's.
That's it.
Yep.
Cool. We're gonna have a conversation with the dude that emailed you because him and I talked behind the scenes. And I feel very comfortable.
Sure, you can bring it up. I'll take a position right now on the ground so you don't feel like I'm changing it. But so, for instance, something you used to say before that I used to kind of sort of take on faith. I thought maybe this was true. It's actually completely not true. You said you cannot make a determination that if you go to bomb a building that you would rather 50 of their civilians die versus one of your soldiers. That's actually completely not true. That is a totally valid decision that one could make in determining whether or not civilian collateral is going to happen.
Do you think that gets? Wait, hold on. Mm-hmm. Do you think that gets to be evaluated? Do you think the International Criminal Court, do you think that international law, do you think that just military mandates from the individual countries themselves can dictate whether or not a commander was or was not putting undue risk to civilians to try and save more lives that they should have been trying to saving when it comes to their troops?
Well, what you're asking me is if there's review for that. So I know that countries themselves conduct these operations, and countries themselves might have an internal review if they want to take something to court or whatever. As far as do international communities get a review of this? I mean, that's a really complicated question, and it depends on who's subjecting themselves to whose authority.
Good. The Geneva Convention, to my understanding, actually specifically talks about this.
That's fine, but I'm pretty sure most of the Geneva Convention stuff has been incorporated under the Hague stuff, which is under the ICC. Which
it might, but I mean, you might be a signer of the Geneva Convention, but not a signatory of anything related to ICJ, right? Like America's not, like you just said, America's not beholden to the ICJ, but America is beholden to the Geneva Convention, right?
I'm not fully sure. I don't believe so. I think most of that got incorporated under the ICC stuff, and I don't think the United States is a signator at all to the ICC, the International Criminal Courts. Now, we're not going to use chemical warfare and everything, because for a variety of reasons, but I believe most of these are under the what protocol that's, I think, incorporated within the ICC, I think, and I don't believe...
Are you talking about the Rome statute?
Am I talking about the what?
He might be. He might be.
Oh, yeah, the Rome Statute. Isn't all of that now incorporated under the International Criminal Courts?
It might be, but I want to ask you about the spirit of the law, and I want to ask you what you think is morally right, because that's what I care about most. I will lean on, like any good debater, I will lean on what is fact when I have to, but I also want to go on what's morally right. So I'm asking you, do you think that is the purpose of combatants to take the brunt of combat and to take on death and to protect civilians, both enemy and domestic, where reasonable?
No.
No? Okay. You and I have a differing opinion there. Okay. I think that if it's 50 of the civilians that are going to die versus 10 of your men, 20 of your men, it's your 10 and 20 men that you put at risk over those 50 civilians.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me just say one thing about the relative risk metric that was said here. So it's not, obviously it's not an analytic equivalence relation. When you look at metrics, that they're proxies and nothing is going to track perfectly. However, you can get to really, really good tracking, especially on the order at the extreme levels. So on like really orders of magnitude, if you have a relative risk that shows like 0.0001, which is basically like your overall like incredibly targeting civilians, well, yeah, that's going to be like just over your overall strategy in that war. Even if there were like individual elements where you were targeting militants, the overall picture, the overall performance in terms of the adherence to discernment is going to be targeting civilians. The reverse is also true with very high relative risk numbers. If your relative risk is 10, 20, 30, 50, it's going to be yes, it's possible that there were individual instances of targeting civilians, but that's not what the question is asking. That's not the answer. That's not the question that we're answering. The question we're answering is your overall performance. Your overall performance was not targeting civilians. Your overall performance was, in fact, very much the other way. It's just the way the math works out. And the higher you go in terms of orders of magnitude on that scale, on the relative risk metric, the more it becomes. I'm sorry.
Edge cases. There's still some edge.
We know this. Yes, there are outliers to any correlate.
I'm saying even if we're just looking at raw numbers, right? Let's say Israel, somebody argues that is indiscriminately bombing civilians, right?
Well, then the question is, then we have to disambiguate the claim. What does that mean? Does that mean the?
Let me just continue for a second. Let's say there's 2 million civilians, and let's say only 30,000 militants, right? And let's say somebody says, oh, it's 50-50, so clearly Israel's not indiscriminately bombing because there was such a small percentage of militants, and they managed to target all of them. But we also have to consider that those militants are likely seeking out those the Israeli soldiers and tanks and stuff. They're going towards the combat. So it's not going to be you can't just look at each human being there as equal in proportionality, because one is escaping and trying to get away from, and the other is going towards the military.
Yeah, so I have adjustments for this. Yep. So I have designated when possible I granulate it, so for example when civilians, now Gaza is a special case because like unfortunately just internal displacement doesn't technically remove you from the battle zone. But first off, so let me just say
hold on, wait, I'm sorry, fuck. Before Avi says okay. I don't think that's a good faith rejection. So, as Abby already said, I'm sure that he's willing to, I would hope so, he's willing to apply a lot of granularity to the analysis. For instance, in the United States, if there were 1,000 soldiers and 99 million civilians, but all 1,000 soldiers lived in Iowa, and you started bombing like places in New York or whatever, you managed to kill a soldier, they're like, oh, look, the ratio is still good. Everybody would say, okay, well, this analysis is inappropriate here. We need to be more granular or more precise for the area. However, this argument of like militants are seeking out tanks and blah, 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 this was not the argument we didn't roll out the indiscriminate bombing of civilians because they were militants running towards tanks. It had to do with the aerial bombing campaign of the Gaza Strip.
No.
And you can apply this to bombing itself, which is, it wouldn't be like civilians are seeking out militants seeking out the IDF. Like even when it was just a bombing campaign.
Let me just clarify my point just a bit. So what I was saying is, let's say, just so it's very clear for everybody, 30,000 militants, 2 million civilians. Let's say, random number, 1,000 militants were killed, 1,000 civilians were killed. And I think most people will conclude this bombing was not indiscriminate if you look at the proportionality and the ratios of deaths, right? Are you following me so far? What I'm saying is, let's say 990 of those militants were killed in direct confrontation, seeking out combat with the IDF, where only 10 militants were killed during the aerial campaign, right? Then you can say bombing was actually indiscriminate because we don't know exactly how those deaths happened.
Yeah. I'm following. Yeah. So we can, so technically, yes, we can dream up. So first of all, I mean, in terms of like whether that's tracking with anything that happened in Gaza, the answer is no. You can look at the relative risks even when they were before the invasion, when they were just doing the bombing campaign, and you can look at relative risks even in other wars, like in Lebanon, when the overwhelming majority were.
I don't think we know the civilian versus militant ratio.
So wait, for what? For Lebanon?
Just the aerial campaign in Gaza so far. We don't know those official numbers. There hasn't been any kind of independent.
Wait. I think first of all, so we did have Gaza Ministry of Health reporting, did we not? Not civilian versus militants.
They didn't tell us. I'm talking civilian versus militants.
Okay.
Because the health ministry doesn't distinguish between.
No, I know that. I'm familiar, but we do have an NGO that has been reporting pretty early into the campaign, and they did discriminate between civilians and militants, and it's a pro-Palestinian NGO, and even then, even using their numbers, it's good. It's like it's not anything close to what you're talking about. And again, the point here is that we can always come up with a hypothetical scenario. I'll grant this. We can come up with a hypothetical scenario where the metric.
You're saying hypothetical, but is it hypothetical for militants to seek out military?
No. It's not. But that's fine. Like, listen, if the militants are making it easier for Israel to be discriminate, that's okay. Great, all the better. If the militants,
but that doesn't mean that the bombardment, the aerial bombardment. I'm saying that doesn't mean that aerial bombardment isn't indiscriminate. Israel can still be indiscriminately aerial bombarding Gaza, right?
Yes,
just because the total.
So we can, and yes, I agree that overall, I do agree overall that there is, and because look, I've been calculating this relative risk from like over and over again as the war has gone on. As the war has gone on, there was like a more intensive phase where more of the deaths were from aerial bombardment because there was the initial phase was a much more heavy bombing. And when that happened, the relative risk was around 16. And then it's been going up. It's been creeping up. And yes, you're right. The reason it has been creeping up is because they're transitioning to a second phase, which is more precise. But this idea, yes, that's fine. But again, even if you do sensitivity analyses where you start stratifying out different portions of the battle, where one portion of the battle would have more of a representation of the aerial bombing, you still don't get those numbers. You still don't get anything close to you still get something that people just are not going to say, oh, this is indiscriminate, unless they have a completely different standard of indiscriminate, which many of the United States performance, they're going to have to say is indiscriminate if they're consistent.
Yeah, I think it's going to be. Do you think Israel will be open to an independent, third-party independent, study on the conflict and to actually go in and actually be able to do an investigation?
You mean like what does that entail? Does it entail like declassifying their military intelligence? Does it mean like declassify? What are we talking about?
Just participating in an independent study on what any war crimes on both sides by Hamas and by.
So I mean. Well, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I can tell you what they've already done. They've already declassified. I can
tell you what they've done several times through several conflicts where they've just kind of shunned off any kind of independent study.
I expect. I mean, if it involves declassifying sensitive information, I expect them to say, just go fuck yourself. The exception that I'm aware of recently was when they started declassifying information to the ICJ. To my knowledge, they declassified about 30 documents so far to the ICJ. So to the ICJ. So my answer to you is to any like just NGO that like B'Tselem or Human Rights Watch or anything like that publishes the things they do. Like probably not. I mean, definitely not for the UN in general.
Well, come on, the history of Israel's hit like the ICJ ruling in 2004. Once ICJ
advisory opinion. Advisory opinion.
Okay, advisory opinion. Once they because Israel did show up to the ICJ in 2004 when it was when they were to discuss the jurisdiction, if the ICJ had jurisdiction over the territories. And once it was confirmed they did, Israel wanted nothing to do with the participation. So it's not even just the ICJ.
I'm just talking about what their actions are right now. Their actions
right. You called out ICJ as being something Israel's interested in participating in and sharing.
Right now they are. Right now they are doing that.
Yeah, this time they are because they know that they're.
Exactly, because there's more pressure now. That's fine. Yeah. So that's my answer to you. My answer to you is like, if there's no pressure on them, like, and I expect them to say, well, we're not declassifying shit for you. Go fuck yourself. That's my expectation for Israel. That's my expectation for just about any country. If there is pressure on them, at some point, different countries are going to yield to different thresholds. And right now, it looks like Israel is at least to some degree yielding for at least some classified information.
Sure. Yeah. And at the end of the day, we're never going to know if a country is truly committing war crimes if they don't disclose. I guess this is a question.
We can make inferences. This is the whole point of my project. The point is that
if no country is ever willing to provide military intelligence or sensitive information, then we can never infer, or maybe we can infer, but we cannot 100% know their reasoning for every single target that they struck. Right? When they say that 70% of residential buildings in Gaza City are now destroyed beyond repair at this point, they're saying.
Where do these numbers come from? Jesus.
we don't know if every single one of those target bombs that
I don't know if any single one is destroyed beyond repair. I don't know where that comes from. I know there's damage to 70%.
It's the damaged or destroyed number, yeah.
No, I saw one that said the damaged or destroyed one was a while ago, like the 45%, but I saw one recently that it was 70% of residential, specifically buildings, were destroyed beyond repair. This
right,
was...
if you can link that and how they're determining what their metric is determining beyond repair, I'd like to see that.
Sure. But just going back to earlier discussion with Destiny about the kind of looking at it in the other way, right? Like if we look at the raw numbers, did Hamas, and I don't know, I didn't look at the casualties, civilians versus military in Israel on October 7th. I don't know.
But I didn't look at the relative percentages as well. I can answer any of these questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what was it? Was it indiscriminate on the other side? Like, was Hamas just killing anybody? And do we know if that was their intention?
I will give you the numbers again. Like, just to address what you said before, we can make inferences. A lot, generally, you're not going to know 100%. You're not going to get every country to declassify everything to you. And if they do, maybe to like some party that may be privy, that may have like not reveal it to the public themselves. No country wants to do this. So yes, a lot of this is just going to be inference work. That doesn't mean we can't make very strong inferences, especially on the extremes. As for October 7th, I can go through this whole calculation. If you're talking about the relative risk I have for October 7th is 3.3, which is on the order of the same sort of relative risk you see for contested genocides and genocides. So occupation of East Timor in Indonesia, 3.8. In Myanmar, their genocide, around 3.6. Bangladesh Liberation War, 3.4.
Are you looking at numbers?
I'm talking about militants killed divided by militant population over civilians killed over civilian population, and it's granulated. It's granulated for October 7th. It's based on all the southern Israel area of the kibbutzim and all the areas that were attacked. How many IDF soldiers were there in the beginning, and each different brigade and each battalion of IDF soldiers that responded. The October 7th battle lasted 72 hours. It wasn't just October 7th. It was October 7th, 8th, and 9th. Yeah. The IDF's kills were 305, but that is across all 3 days. The vast majority of them died on the first day because the vast majority of them showed up on the first day. Now, they were late. They were way too late, but...
How many sorry, I'm sure you have all these numbers in front of you, so I just wanted to, be round off questions to you. How many total were killed? Was it like 1,300, 1,400, 1,200? It was
around 1,200 where the total deaths for October 7th on the Israeli side was around 1,200. That includes IDF soldiers, security forces, includes civilians, foreign nationals, and...
Okay, 1,200. How many were soldiers, you said? You said 300?
IDF soldiers, 305. And that includes reservists, by the way.
Does that include like
reservists?
Police, security, anyone who had a gun that could have potentially been shooting back.
No, wait. Does not include police. Remember with Kasled, the whole thing with Kasled was that the pro-Palestinian side wanted the standard.
I don't know anything about Kasled. I haven't done research on it.
Right.
So
no, but this is important. It's important. So like in Kasled, the Israelis targeted Palestinian police forces, and it was
saying they called them civilians.
And yes, there was a huge point of contention in Kasled whether they were civilians or whether they should be classified as militants. And the way the UN came out on that in the Goldstone report was that unless you have, on an individual basis, the assumption is that police forces are civilians and they are not militants, unless you can show that they took up arms.
Okay, the reason why the two scenarios are different, and you can tell me if you feel like I'm being bad faith. I feel like one side can, let's say a police headquarters in Gaza. It's just bombed by a airstrike, right? Versus, let's say, a police headquarters in Israel is like confronting those that are entering Israel
on the holiday where almost everyone was off duty.
I don't know. Is that what happened? I don't know. Were they all off duty? Was there no police on duty? I have no idea.
It was Simchat Torah, so it was the high holiday it was one of the major holidays in Judaism. A whole bunch of the forces, even a whole bunch of the IDF forces were off duty. They were celebrating, and so there's multiple different reports. We don't know the exact proportion off. Some say maybe like half plus. Some say the majority were off duty. But the point is that
you're saying all of these civilians that you're saying that died on October 7th, every single one was not an off-duty IDF soldier.
So wait, hold on. So I'll break it. I'll tabulate it right now. Look,
Sure.
Okay. So for the Israeli civilians, so there's Israeli citizens that were 600. So that was 695.
Let me write this down.
Yeah.
Okay. So 695.
695 were Israeli citizens, and they were not members of security forces at all.
Then there idea. They were just regular citizens.
They were not. Yeah, they were not police. They were not IDF. 695 were Israeli citizens. Then there's foreign national workers. A lot of these were Thai workers that were killed. Okay. They are also considered civilian, or at least non-combatants. Those were 70
civilians. Let's just put them all under civilians.
Yeah, fine. Those were 71.
Okay.
Then there are hostages that were killed in captivity, which do not include the 3 hostages killed by IDF friendly fire.
Okay, but how do we know they were killed? We have no idea.
Hamas claims they have bodies of them. So,
okay, but didn't they also claim that IDF bombs were what killed them?
We can all. Well, yes, that's this.
We can all say that they're lying, but it goes both ways. So I don't think it's.
Sure, we can split the difference if you want, but or we can not even include them. The inference is still going to go through. It's not going to this portion of the relative risk. We could even assume they were all killed by the IDF if you want. That's fine. The inference still.
No, we don't need to assume that. We just don't know. We just TBD.
We don't know. Right? And then there's police force. The police forces killed were 58.
Police force 58. Got it.
Yeah.
And you said IDF was 370
IDF
something?
was 305. IDF soldiers killed, including reservists, were 305.
Okay, let me just read it back to you and make sure I have it right. You said 695 Israeli civilians, 71 foreign nationals, 58 police force, and 305.
58. You said 58?
Yeah, 58. Okay. 58 police force and 305. If we were to add, let me just do the math quickly. So if we take the police force and the IDF soldiers killed divided by the total killed, what percentage is that of potential resistance from Israel?
Wait. You're classifying all the police forces as militants now? So I can do that for
not militants. I'm saying anyone who could potentially have been resisting.
Sure.
Armed resistance.
Okay.
Right.
Sure. So then
in Palestine picks up a gun, they're gonna just call him a militant, right? Obviously, because you're fighting them in one way.
This is I'm fine doing the analysis this way. I just want to let you know this is deviating from the way the United Nations recommended doing it, but that's fine. It's deviating from even the pro-Palestinian side. Like the pro-Palestinian side would not accept this standard for their own side.
But we just talked about how
we can do it. I'm happy to do it, but I'm just letting you know.
Wait, I have to caveat. If a police force, like, think about it, right?
I understand the logic. Believe me, I understand the logic. You don't have to explain it to me. I'm just letting you know that in terms of the
why talk raw numbers if we're not gonna back it up with some kind of
You're free to disagree with the pro-Palestinian side, and you're free to disagree with the UN. I often disagree with them myself. I'm just letting you know that you're taking that stance. That's fine. I'm happy to do it that way if you want.
I don't think that's the pro-Palestinian UN stance on this specific instance.
UN it is. In the UN, absolutely, and that this was a huge issue in Cast-Led. That was a huge fight between.
October 7th, I'm saying this is for the conflict of October 7th. Maybe the UN saw the police as civilians.
They were saying the police officers were the majority were off duty. That's the claim.
Sure. Okay. So let's just go with whatever numbers you have to make it easier. I don't want you to recalculate things.
Well, the numbers I can recalculate it any way you want, and it's not going to make a difference to the inference. But the numbers, what I did was I took the UN standard. I said, okay, unless we have individual evidence on the individual level, which I do on Cast-Led, but I assumed they were civilians anyway. So I was really charitable to the Palestinian side for Cast-Led. But in terms of this, I considered on the high holidays they were off duty. Majority, that was the claim. At least the majority of the police officers were off duty. And I don't have individual evidence on individual level they took up arms, so 58 were classified as civilians. So the total, and then the hostages were 38 that were killed in captivity. I know they claim they're from bombs, but every time I see a video, it looks like they're conveniently shot in the back of the head, and it doesn't look like they were bombed. But whatever. So 38, and so that you get a total of 862 civilians.
Okay, and do we know? And please don't take what I'm saying as conspiracy, because I genuinely do not know. Okay, These are arguments I've heard, so I have no idea. I have no position on this. Is it the case? Is it possible that some of those civilians were killed by Israeli forces Or is that impossible? Yes, was that just a complete fake news?
Yes, it is. And I did it, and I also, and that's why I did it.
Oh shit! I just got back. Oh my god, are we talking about the claim that it was the Israeli military that killed most of the civilians?
Oh, you came back at the perfect time.
Oh yeah, because I saw this as part of that Hamas report that they were repeating that claim, and I thought
I have no idea if that's true. I don't know.
Oh well, that was part of this.
I can answer that, and that's why I also did the October 7th analysis from the IDF side, from the IDF friendly fire. The IDF friendly fire is about 1% of the total civilians killed. There were two.
Okay.
There were two incidents that were confirmed. There were like 100 conspiracy theories, of which there were 2 incidents that turned out to be at least plausible or real and that are being investigated. One is an incident in Kibbutz Be'eri where there was a tank that fired on a home where there were a bunch of Hamas terrorists that were holding hostages, or freedom fighters, if you want to call them that were holding hostages, whichever term you like. And then they were shelled by a tank. And up to 13 of the hostages died. It's disputed how many of them were killed from the tank shell or how many of them were killed by Hamas. Some say that one was a
small enough number to not really move the needle.
I considered all 13 of them for the Israeli performance side, 13 to be the number that were killed there. I just did the maximum attributable friendly fire. And then there was one other event where there was a crossfire with a tractor that was used by Hamas when they were taking 3 hostages. 2 of the hostages were wounded. One hostage was killed in the IDF crossfire. So you give a total of 14. That's
insignificant.
Yeah.
Doesn't even need to we don't even have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Enough to not really matter.
It's around 1% of the total kill.
Okay. And now one more question, and for you, for all the numbers that you put together. Mm-hmm. Is it fair or unfair to also take into consideration the capabilities of both Israeli and Hamas military capabilities? And what I mean by that specifically is, let's say Hamas had the ability to, I don't know, precisely bomb Israeli military infrastructure without having to go in like a bunch of guerrillas with guns to, start shooting people up, right? Mm-hmm. So the number that you gave, the 3.6, don't you think it's going to always sway more to that? Those that have less.
Well, no. In fact, I think if we were to make the adjustment, it would go the other way, and I'll tell you why. Because Hamas had a very, very unique experience in which they had a very easy picking. October 7th. And the reason is because in combination with the Jewish high holidays and everything and the intelligence failure, they had an average of around 12 hours of free reign to basically do whatever the fuck they wanted. So, and that's going to take precedence. Yep. That is
that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think it was 6 hours or something that no military was deployed. That's true. Yeah, I didn't think about that.
For some areas, it took 20 hours for the IDF to arrive. So basically, you can make if you're going to make a technology argument, I'm going to make an argument. Hey, you have all these weapons and guns and no opposing fighters. You can go in and do whatever the fuck you want, and they did. Okay, and they showed us what they wanted, and they
makes sense. I mean, to be clear, what they did was terrible, stupid, and just.
Yeah, I'm just saying in terms of ease of accomplishing your military objectives, they had a very easy time doing it. They had a great opportunity, and they did it.
Yeah. Okay. I guess my question back to Des